Hello, I do apologise for that. I really apologise. I had the screen wrong and you couldn't read anything. So thank you for joining me again. I'm sorry that I caused a bit of an issue there with the technology I've been using. So so where were we? Looking at the journey so far, as I said earlier, chapter 3 is quite a challenging one for me personally. If you have a look, I've called it I've called it Teachers Talk. There you go, Teachers Talk. And so this has been a challenge for me, and that is the point of the Bible, that it challenges you personally. If it doesn't, how are you reading it? I'm sorry we can't read it together. We have to read it this way at the moment. That's the way it is at the moment. So chapter 3, Teachers Talk. And but before we get into that, let's just do a little bit of a refresh for where we are. So remembering we're listening to one side of the conversation, and this is a very early book in the New Testament. It's a very Jewish book, and there's a few Jewish things that are going to crop up as we go through the Bible, as we go through this chapter. And it is written to scattered Christians who've effectively refugees, they've turned up in different places, and we don't know where exactly, but they're oppressed. They've lost all their home, they've lost money, things like that. So they're Christians that are, at the bottom of the rung economically and generally, and there's a level of illiteracy generally, so people can't read and write, and then that's why in teachers, James is the big thing about teachers, because teachers are really important because they presumably could read or had access to someone who could read for them or show them. So so this is what James was generally writing to a poor, illiterate bunch of Christians scattered that we don't know where. So that's where we're at. And then if we look at James chapter 1. Sorry, I got too far. So James chapter 1 was, when you're being tested, don't lose sight of that end goal, and ask for wisdom, and don't be like your oppressors. And then James chapter 2 is that image of showing favoritism, of giving a rich person turns up to the church and given the best seat in the house, and the poor person is meant to sit at the back, and don't show that kind of favoritism, but do show your faith in the works by your works, by what you do, show your faith. So those are James chapter 1 and James chapter 2, and then we go on to James chapter 3. But before we do that, I'd like to just almost give you a prologue to James chapter 3. And as I said, James is a very Jewish book, and part of the Jewish, a big tradition in Jewish history and Judaism is Proverbs, and they're very small kind of words of wisdom, very practical words of wisdom. So and almost this proverb is almost like the introduction, like the trailer to James. I think James builds on this. James unpacks a lot of James chapter 3 from this verse, and there's about 10-20 verses from Proverbs I could have chosen, but this one was kind of the most obvious one to choose, and it's Proverbs 21:23. Those who guard their mouths and their tongues keep themselves from calamity or disaster. So and there's another proverb I'm going to refer to at the end. Proverbs 21:23. That's those who guard their mouths and keep their tongues, guard their mouths and their tongues, keep themselves from calamity. And that's a big theme in James chapter 3. We'll get into the nuts and bolts of James chapter 3 now. So if we look at the very first sentence, not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers. And that's a kind of a reminder that this passage is really all about teachers, those people who use their words to instruct. And you might think, because James refers to teachers a lot in this passage, and you might think, well, I'm not a teacher, I don't work in a school, and that may be so, but if you think this doesn't apply to me because I'm not a teacher, then there's also the idea of you're probably not a Christian who's been scattered 2,000 years ago. So you could say none of James applies to you because it wasn't written to you. But we need to think about, okay, I might not be a teacher, but I often think about where's your sphere of influence. Where do you go where you have an influence over someone? What, it could be online, it could be in the home, it could be amongst your friends. So where do you have your sphere of influence? It's just bearing that in mind, about the power you have through the words you use, the words you choose, in your sphere of influence. And communication is a wonderful gift. And James shows us we can build each other up, we can encourage each other, we can give good advice, but also James warns us that we can drag each other down with our tongue. Proverbs is something that James draws from, but also I think one thing that shows is that James also draws from Jesus himself. If we look at the next passage, let's go to let's go to Matthew 23, 6-8, and then we'll come back to that reflection. So Matthew 23, 6-8 says, this is to the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. They love to have the place of honour at the banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi, which is like a teacher, but also a term of honour. They love to be bigged up, but you're not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher and you're all students. And I think James really builds on that again. This Matthew was written down later than James, but these words of Jesus that James, who may have been Jesus' brother, kind of are echoing in what James writes to these scattered Christians. That you're all students, and the teachers are not meant to have sort of these best places. So we're just going to have a little pause now for me to catch my breath, and we're going to ask a question, and that is, what is your sphere of influence, and what does it look like when you bring words of life to that place? So what is your sphere of influence? If there's ever a place that you inhabit the most, like I say, it could be online, it could be on home, at work, it could be amongst friends. Think about your sphere of influence, and then what does it look like when you bring words of life to that place? So I'm gonna skedaddle and let you have a think. thank you for that. We've had Lee has said, my sphere of influence is when I'm with the children and young people in our youth groups. It comes to life when I learn from them, when I listen to them and engage in conversation, explain their knowledge of the Bible. Blows me away. So thank you, Lee, for that. So we've all got a place where we have influence. And I'm sure Lee's is the youth and children's worker here at St Mary's. And I know that Lee brings a lot of life through assemblies that she does in our schools and things like that. So thank you, Lee. Yeah, so just think about my sphere of influence. I think at the moment now is my home, because I feel with lockdown being homebound is more important, and the words that I can give to my kids and my wife, and how I can, when I'm, grumpy and cross and tired and hungry, and I can actually, I have a choice to build them up or bring them down, and that's where James chapter 3 has kind of influenced me to think about, bigging them up and supporting my children, so thank you for that. So we're gonna jump across to pictures. So we've got 4 pictures there. There's like a quiz show, and it's the picture round, but it's not the picture round now. It's James in chapter 3 uses loads of pictures, and again, I think this is why people love the book of James. They're very easy to sort of follow and carry on, and these pictures that James uses, I think, are they're timeless, really. So we've got a forest fire. We've got a horse, and that thing in its mouth is the bit that kind of directs it. And then there's a ship, and the bottom there is the rudder. And generally, people might not travel by horse much more these days, but kind of people know that, if you've got the bit in the horse, you can kind of direct the horse, that kind of thing. I mean, I don't really ride horses, but I know that, you can watch cowboy films with my dad when I was younger. You can direct the horse with the bit, and I've been to Barking Park and got those pedalos, the ones where you have to use your feet to make and you in between yourself and the next person is the small udder that directs the big boat, and the fire. We all know about the fires in California we've had the last few years, and south of France gets lots of fires as well. So those are amazing contemporary references, and there's more that James uses, and that makes James, I think, a really easy book to think about and to be challenged by. So what James is talking about here, he uses sort of 3 pictures, and he says that the tongue is a bit like the bit, that metal thing in the horse's mouth, and it's the impact he talks about of our tongue. There's 3 different emphasis. And the first one is the horse, and the bit controls the impact of the horse, where the horse goes, and then the rudder is about direction, about the direction of where you're going, and finally the last image he uses is the forest fire, which is destruction. So those are 3 images that it's a kind of to press home about how important the teacher's words are, and the small instructions that these teachers have massive impact. So a huge oil tanker is directed by a tiny rudder in comparison, and a forest fire is started by a spark, whether it's a lightning bolt or a cigarette or a tiny a campfire, can cause a massive blaze. So I think James is pressing upon his listeners the importance of the tongue, and how devastating the tongue can be, and the impact of the tongue. Small instructions can have a big impact, and and one thing that's interesting here is the idea of let's go back. To James 3. Okay, there we go. James chapter 2. James chapter 3 verse 2. haven't we talked about this word in red here, the idea of things being perfect? And in our culture, we seem to think perfect as spotless, as I remember when I was in school, someone had to write an essay on the inside of a ping pong ball, a white ping pong ball, and you think about the idea of that being like without blemish, or a white room, and we assume perfect is spotless, but that's not quite the idea that James has. The idea of perfection in James's and a Jewish idea of perfection is mature and complete, and so like when we say when James says anyone who's never at fault in what they say is perfect, it's rather that they're mature and complete. They've reached a level of maturity that James says, yeah, that's it, but he kind of prefaces it by saying we all stumble in many ways and nobody's perfect. So I guess I find that kind of I find that quite encouraging and realistic that James is able to sort of encourage us, but also remind us of who we are. That we are people who make mistakes, but also we are people who can big each other up. And James sort of treads that line between in this chapter of reminding us of our responsibilities, reminding us of the bad things that can happen of the tongue, but also the positive impact of the tongue as well. If we skip along to James chapter 6, chapter 3 verse 6, I'm sorry, he goes from the previous images of the horse's bit, the rudder and the forest fire are kind of what I learned in my GCSE days as similes, and then in verse 6 he turns the tongue into a metaphor. The idea of he goes to metaphor of like the tongue is a fire, and it's pretty harsh words in verse 6. The tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body. It sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and as itself is set on fire by hell. And then those are pretty troubling verses. And I was tempted to not mention them because they're not very fun, but I decided to actually talk about them a little bit because, we should. I don't want to skirt around the tough bits in the Bible, but when I think about the body there, there's two images of the body that James uses: the body of Christ, the people, the church, and I think that's what James is getting at here a little bit as well. It's like teachers can corrupt the whole body, and then the whole of the Christian audience that can be go one way or another, and it sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and it's set itself by fire. And so there's the idea of, that sounds what we use in a term that is used by people who study the Bible. It's apocalyptic. You think of that's like the doom and gloom and the end of the world, like a sudden apocalypse, like the world ends through a massive explosion. That's the idea of the apocalypse, and here we've got almost apocalyptic language, the whole course of one's life on fire. So this idea of this whole consuming fire, and that could be quite challenging for us because we want to think about the Bible as being love and goodness, but also James uses a real almost horrible image of everything on fire and a scary image, but it's almost to contrast the creativity of God here. So what James is saying is that we can very easily undo all God's goodness and God's creation using the words that we use. So he kind of harks back to this kind of creation of being of order out of chaos. And that's what Genesis was. There was chaos, and then God brought order. But actually, our tongue can bring back that chaos and kind of be the anti-God in this thing. So what's interesting about what James talks about the tongue is that a lot of the New Testament, the words are the challenge of the words is to do with right teaching in terms of being doctrinally correct, that's correct to the words of Jesus. And later on, the Christians are influenced by other teaching, and Paul is like writing a lot later and saying, like, don't listen to that false teaching. But James isn't concerned with false teaching. James is concerned with right living and using the right words that build each other up. So you can tell it's that idea of that. It's still a little bit early Christianity where the false teaching hasn't kind of come into the church yet. What James's emphasis and James is really pushing is that right living and right words, words that build each other up, are really important rather than sort of false teaching. So that's a bit of a difference between what James is talking about at the time and what Paul's talking about. I love this quote by the theologian called Doug Moo. He's got a funny name. He says, far easier are to heal the wounds caused by sticks and stones than the damage caused by words. And when I grew up, we were taught sticks and stones might break your bones, but names will never hurt me. But we know that actually now that's not true. Like the words that we use can build each other up and to bring life, or bring a lot of death and hurtfulness. And Doug Moo kind of gets, uses that as to remind us that our words can cause a lot of damage. So let's carry on. We're going back to some more images. So we've there got a spring of water. We've got two watery images and two natural images. We've got a spring of water, and we've got some fig trees there, some grapes, and some salt water. And so he's talked about the problem, the damage that the tongue can do. But all these images explore the appropriateness of the teacher and the words they use to drag down or destroy those who are made in God's image. So I think he's talking about the misuse of the tongue again, and it's kind of like if we look at it there, James says, James 3:9-10, with the tongue we can praise our Lord and Father, and with it we can curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. So he's kind of like saying, like, you can't have a spring water that has salt water and spring water. You can't have a spring that has two types of water. Either a spring has spring water that you can drink from, or you find salt water in the sea, and it can't be the same. And it kind of feels like he's harking back to what he's talking about earlier about our belief and the words that we use. It's hard to bless someone and curse someone, or bless God and curse. It's impossible. There's something wrong. There's no harmony in the idea of saying how much we love God, but then actually being disrespectful to our neighbour or our family member or someone we work with. And James is, I think, getting at his readers to try to harmonise that it's right to praise God, but equally we need to make sure our words with our neighbour match up. That's that kind of idea of God and us, like trying to harmonise the relationship people have with God and the respect that people have with God. In those days, they had a huge respect for God, but James says, you've got to equally have that respect for your fellow Christians, for the poorest people in your community, for everyone. You've got to have that respect. And so it's kind of like, it's a challenge for me, personally. And so he talks about God's likeness there. And that is harking back to Genesis. So if you think about Genesis chapter 1, it says man and woman were made in God's image, in God's likeness. And that's a really important point that James is reminding his audience that the people that they interact with are made in God's image. And that's, I think all the problems in the world could be solved if everyone treated everyone as, as if they were made in God's image and they have God's fingerprint on their life. The whole, it's a very, even now it's still challenging. Like, can we each day treat everyone that we interact with in our sphere of influence as if they're made in the image of God? And that's really challenging. So that's a really important thing. And we're going to move on to wisdom here. And this is one of my favourite quotes, and I had to put it in. James is talking about there's three ways you can talk. You can those people pursuing envy and ambition, or those people who are part of wisdom and godly wisdom. And I like the idea of wisdom versus knowledge. And knowledge is knowing that the tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is not putting that into a fruit salad. And people say the next one is philosophy is wondering whether ketchup is a smoothie, which I find quite interesting to think about. James kind of reverts back to this idea of choosing wisdom, and wisdom that builds up. And I think it's like knowledge in action is wisdom. So there's two sort of kinds of wisdom that James talks about. In James 3:3-16 says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbour bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly and unspiritual and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." So I think, James is asking us to choose wisdom in your situation. True wisdom brings peace, brings joy, brings life, brings godliness to those But there can be that envious, selfish ambition that we can also bring. So this is the wisdom that and I love this verse here that James brings. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. And I'm just going to take a break from talking and just let those words sink into your conscious about letting wisdom enter into your life and being a peacemaker. I hope you found that helpful. I definitely feel like just thinking what being a peacemaker and reaping a harvest of righteousness. I know that sort of encourages me. So we're going to have another pause for reflection, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I think back about the good advice I've received, and that can also be really helpful to think, oh, I'm so glad that person said that to me. And I've definitely, I guess I personally wouldn't be here without people giving me good advice. And I think when we're thinking about the words we use that can build up and give life, I think advice is the words that gives life. So we've got a bit of a time for us to reflect, and you can write it down in the comments. We've got quite a few comments on Facebook Live, so thanks for that, and I'll try and go through them shortly. But just for you to think about, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received? And you don't have to put it in the comments. It might just be something for you to reflect on. The best piece of advice you've ever received. I hope you had a good chance to reflect. I've had we've got, Lee says, someone once said to me, don't try and defend God, he's big enough to do that for himself. When you try and defend him, others can't hear him, so they only hear you. So true. Yeah, thank you for that, Lee. Don't try and defend God. That's good advice. Very good. I've had someone trying to attack God through contacting me this week, and I trust that God can defend himself and doesn't need me to defend God. So thanks for that, Lee. That's some good advice there. So we're going to kind of wrap up our reflection on chapter 3, but we're just going to finish by thinking about Moses, which is it's a bit strange, but in chapter 3, James says that they are to show their good works with the gentleness born of wisdom, which is kind of reflecting back to James chapter 1. In James chapter 1, James encourages his listeners to humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. And so at the start of James, James says, accept these words. But at the end of in chapter 3, his message is for the teachers to show their good works in gentleness, born of wisdom. What James is trying to do is encourage the teachers to teach with gentleness and non-aggressive and not in a boastful kind of way. And that kind of refers back to Moses. And if you think about, for a Jewish audience, Moses is one of the key players in Jewish history. Moses is one that went up the mountain and got the Ten Commandments, and a lot of all the Jewish identity comes from the Ten Commandments. And Moses was kind of like one of the early fathers of Judaism. And so for James to appeal to kind of something that connects with Moses is quite a big thing. If we look at this, passage from Numbers chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife. Now, Cushite is modern day Ethiopia, so they're a bit upset that he's got a mixed race marriage. So he had married a Cushite, so he's getting stick from his relatives because he married outside of Judaism to someone from a different place. So has the Lord spoken only through Moses? They asked him. Has he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. And then this is the bit that's in red is so important. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. And I think James is kind of harking back to that, like Moses, the greatest teacher who got the Ten Commandments where we get everything. He was the most humble man. He teaches you need to be like that. You need to remember, if you're going to be a teacher in this new Christianity, this new messianic faith, you need to replicate this Moses, who was very humble in the face of criticism. He was so humble, and I think it goes back to there that James is kind of trying to echo. Don't forget, like, be this kind of guy, be this Moses, and I think when I think about this passage, it comes back to this power of life and death. The tongue has power of life and death, and those who eat from it, those who love it, will eat from its fruit. Going back to Proverbs, this is maybe like bookended by two proverbs here, that the tongue has the power of life and death. And that's one thing that I'm taking with me, I think it was Rowan Williams who said that humility is a willingness to learn from anyone. And I think that in my words, and my actions, I need to take on that humility as someone who does teach and someone who is involved in preaching, that learning from anyone is really important, and knowing that my words have the power of life and death. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm just going to pray. I haven't prayed at the end of any of these, but I think I'm going to do that today, partly because it's been quite challenging for me personally, So I'm just going to pray. I know I love to pray with you in person, but everything's digital, so I thought, why not pray in digital? So I'm just going to pray, and then we're going to finish. God, I thank you for these words of life that you have for us. And I pray that we would mirror those words of life, and in our sphere of influence, that we would give good advice to those people who need it, and that we would heal and bring life to those people that we interact with every day through our words. Amen. Thanks for joining me. Just to remind you, James chapter 4 will be next Tuesday. And thanks for watching.